All right. As people filter in from the waiting room, we will start getting our presentation going. We're going to start with some introductions. My name is Sarah Staudt. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Prison Policy Initiative. The Prison Policy Initiative is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that for over 2 decades has provided cutting-edge research and analysis to expose the harms of mass incarceration. To give a little bit of an introduction of my own background, I've been working in criminal legal system reform for over a decade. I started as a criminal defense attorney and then as a state level advocate in Illinois, where I worked on the end of monetary bond and also the establishment of a medical release program in Illinois, as well as a wide range of other issues. So I've worked at both the state and the local and now the national level, trying to convince policymakers to pass transformative changes to our legal system. And I'm going to have Emmett introduce himself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emmett Sanders, the Policy and Advocacy Associate at your Prison Policy Initiative.
So sorry.
I,
There we go. So sorry, Emmett. Please go on.
okay. I work with Sarah in our advocacy department, where we connect with and support on-the-ground organizations and advocacy campaigns all over the country. I've been with PPI for almost 2 years now. And before that, I did some pretty extensive research and advocacy work on electronic monitoring and other issues. And I first came to advocacy work through my own experiences with incarceration. So I'll turn it back over to Sarah now.
Let me make sure the spotlight's switched. Are we okay? Great.
There we go.
And just a little housekeeping for the interpreters. With my slides up, I actually can't see the chat. So you will need to intro, or actually, no, I think I can. Never mind. Sorry.
May I suggest that you actually give us co-host if you can, and then we can take care of that ourselves.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I had done that for Ebony, but not for you. So there you go. All right. Sorry for the housekeeping, folks. The purpose of today's webinar is to share some insights from a resource that we developed a few months ago that's focused on advocacy strategies around talking about recidivism. So Emmett's going to drop a link to that toolkit in the chat, and we'll drop it a couple more times throughout the webinar just to make sure that you can access it. When we start to talk about studies and other things in this webinar, the links to those you're going to find all in that toolkit. But the reason that we decided to put together this toolkit and this webinar is because we're increasingly hearing politicians, law enforcement, talk about the quote unquote repeat offender as they push back against recent criminal legal system reforms. And really that brings to mind questions about recidivism. So we wanted to give advocates tools to talk about those statistics intelligently and help policymakers understand them. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This webinar is being recorded. It will be placed on our website after the webinar is done. It'll probably take us about a week to get it up, but then it will be there in perpetuity. Please use the question and the answer function to ask questions that we can cover at the end of the webinar. Please don't use the chat to ask questions, as it will be very easy for us to miss those. And we will place both the slides and the recording, as I said, on our website at the end of, after today's presentation, about a week later. So without further ado, I'll get started. So let's talk about what we're going to go over today. There's 5 sort of basic topics we're going to cover. The first is a why question. Why is it that recidivism takes central stage in so many reform fights? And that's really talking about the Willie Horton effect, which is something that I think many of us have heard of and dealt with before. Then we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of statistics. What are the common measures of recidivism, and what questions should we be asking about them when we see them? We're going to get into the numbers for real. How high is recidivism really, and what can we do to understand those numbers better? I'm going to talk a little bit about common myths about recidivism, specifically around violent and sex-related offenses. And then Emmett's going to end our webinar by talking about some ways that we can talk about post-release success instead of recidivism, so that policymakers have a more positive view of what happens after people leave prison. And with that, I will turn it back to Emmett to talk a little bit about why this ends up taking center stage in fights.
Thanks, Sarah. Again, everyone. So the Willie Horton ad. Most people know about the Willie Horton ad, but just for some background, it refers to an ad that was supported by George H.W. Bush. This is a campaign against Michael Dukakis in 1988. Dukakis had been the governor of Massachusetts when a weekend furlough program was in effect. This furlough program allowed people who were in prison to return home for the weekends. Um, and there were programs like this in many other states. Ronald Reagan actually championed them as the governor of California, for example. Um, but the ad was heavily racialized. So let's be clear, no one looks good in mugshots. These are pictures that are taken at pretty traumatic moments in people's lives. However, this picture of Willie Horton was taken after he'd been held in solitary confinement for days to make him look as unkempt as possible, right? And there are some obvious racial implications here in the way this ad is presented. Um, but effectively, the ad was a dog whistle designed to play into the racialized fears of white suburban voters. Um, and now, while the original ad might not have actually had as big an effect on the election as we originally thought, these ads are still in existence and they're more alive than ever today. Next slide, please. Okay, so strategies for fighting the Willie Horton effect. So, how do we push back against a form of politics that relies on demonizing people for the purpose of getting voters to vote out of fear rather than for common sense policies that actually keep us safe? Well, are several strategies that folks have used. We'll talk about them now. So, first, we can create counter narratives, right? Focus on creating counter narratives that underscore what successful reentry looks like, and what is possible, particularly when people have opportunity and support. Um, you involve family and community members and get them to speak on the person's impact and on their importance in the community. Secondly, data. While tough on crime politicians often rely on the specter of violent recidivism to stay in office. The truth is that the vast majority of people who are leaving prison do not commit violent crimes upon release, and we'll talk about that later. But the Willie Horton ad stands out because it was a rare instance, right? And contextualizing individual events and being able to communicate with data how rare they are can actually reduce the impact of these scare tactics. Thirdly, another thing we could do is to demonstrate to politicians that there is public support for reforms. There are polls and all these things, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But finally, the truth is that reform-minded politicians often do face attacks for their views. And we need to defend these politicians when their opponents come at them with tough on crime rhetoric. This is actually perhaps the most important thing that advocates can do. Over time, advocates can build trust and between themselves and politicians who support reform, so that politicians know that they can call on them when they're being attacked. And activists will help with messaging and counter narratives and these kinds of things. Next slide, please. So back to public opinion data. So this is from Forward US from 2024. This is national data. But you'll see here that 80% of voters support increasing earned time, 72% of voters support expanding parole, 79% voters support a second look, like mandatory minimums. Uh, this is national data, and local data is almost always going to be more persuasive to local politicians than national data, but these provide a good starting point for the conversation. And I'll turn it back over to Sarah now.
Great.
Hi,
Okay.
hi, Sarah. This is the interpreter. Sorry to interrupt. We sent a message in the chat. Could you please add spotlight only? Thanks so much.
Add spotlight only. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good for now, but
Okay.
the interpreter keeps disappearing every time you all
Oh,
switch.
oh, I see. Every time I switch. Gotcha. Um, all right. We're going to dive in now to some information about understanding recidivism statistics. What do they actually mean? Sometimes we'll just hear a number and not a lot of context about what that number actually represents. So I want to start by framing this around a mismatch that we see a lot. There's a mismatch between what people think of as recidivism and what it actually means. People think about recidivism as a measure of behavior. They assume that every measured instance of recidivism is a new, intentionally committed crime. That tends to be the way that people understand these numbers. And that's true of the public and also often of policymakers. But the better way to think about recidivism, I think, is as a measure of interaction with the system. It both undercounts and overcounts instances of harm. So, of course, anything that measures crime is going to undercount some instances of harm. Not everyone who commits harm is arrested or convicted or prosecuted. Um, but importantly, recidivism also overcounts instances of harm. And the reason is because not every arrest leads to a conviction, not every conviction leads to reincarceration, and not every arrest or recidivism event in general is actually a crime. In most of the recidivism statistics that we're going to look at, technical violations are also included. So those are non-criminal acts and acts that most people wouldn't even necessarily see as harmful. And so when you have a raw percentage, like 60% of people are reincarcerated, it actually covers a huge range of behavior other than what people are thinking of, which is often these Willie Horton-like situations. So there are three common measures of recidivism. These are really, we've looked at recidivism numbers all over the country, and these are the three that we see. So I'm going to talk through them and also talk about some of the things that you should think about if you're faced with a number that's in these categories. So the first number is rearrest. And that counts, okay, of a certain number of people who were released from prison over a certain period of time, how many people were rearrested for anything over the next period of time, usually 3 years. We'll talk about that. This usually includes arrests both for technical violations and also arrests for relatively minor crimes. So there usually isn't a differentiation between those really serious crimes that people get arrested for and these less serious instances. The second basic stat that we see is reconviction. This is sort of an interesting one because it generally doesn't include technical violations. So in some ways, it is a little bit closer to that measuring of actual new crime. But it does, of course, likely include convictions for minor new crimes, little things. And then the most common by far that we see is reincarceration or return to prison. Usually this will be expressed as how many people released in a certain year from prison returned to the prison system or sometimes jail within 3 years. So sometimes you'll see this number split into prison and jail incarceration. Other times it will all be lumped together, and other times it will exclude jail entirely. It generally does include reincarceration for both technical violations and new convictions, though increasingly we're seeing that states will actually differentiate between those two categories, which is very helpful. So this is a graph we put together a couple years ago. So some of this may have changed, but this was from 2019. And it looks at what states track which measures. Almost every state tracks something. Uh, Usually you're going to find this data on Department of Corrections websites and similar repositories of public information. But those Department of Corrections websites are where these are often stored, usually called something simple like recidivism report. What you can see is that most states count some kind of reincarceration number, with a couple more counting rearrest and reconviction. So it does vary depending on where you are, but that reincarceration number is the one we see the most frequently. So for all of these measures, when you see a number, when you're told 30% of people who were released in 2018 were rearrested for a new crime, or were rearrested, was usually how it's stated, here's some questions to ask. What's the follow-up window? Is it 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? We'll see that some of the federal statistics have a 10-year follow-up window, which is really long to track people. And then ask, how does recidivism change over those time periods? What we know is that most recidivism events actually happen within that first year of release. And so the curve levels off as you start to move towards those longer time periods. And then this is a key point that I really want you to remember. How does the group of people being measured in the recidivism statistic, which is almost always everyone released from prison, compare to the group of people being targeted for reform? So generally, when we're working on reforms, our reforms primarily target certain groups of people. So for example, when we're working on parole reform, it's going to target groups of people who are not currently eligible for parole. So how are the people who are going to be affected by reform older than average? If you're doing a medical or elder parole bill, you're talking about folks who are, usually over 55 or over 60. Do they have different kinds of underlying offenses? And all of these factors, demographic factors, questions about charges, can make recidivism rates for the group you're talking about drastically different than the average recidivism rate overall. This is a graph that we put together actually for a partner organization. I'm going to give a plug at the end of the webinar. We help partner organizations look at data. And this was something that we did for a partner organization, which is why the categories are what they are. But I wanted to show this graph because I think it demonstrates the ways in which recidivism rates can vary hugely depending on what group of people you're looking at. So this is rates of return to California prisons within 3 years of release for everybody released from CDCR from 2013 to 2019. So a big long window. You can see that for men, which is sort of, you can think of as a baseline, is about 22.7% of people return to prison. But if you're working on a parole bill in California and are interested primarily in people who have served 15 or more years, then that percentage is 5%. If you're looking at people with violent crimes, it's 15%. If you're looking at people with indeterminate sentences, it's even lower. And so a lot of states are going to make it difficult for you to break down the information in this way. But if you can, it can be very helpful for policymakers to understand that that general recidivism number, which is often driven up by younger folks, by other sort of demographic characteristics, may not be applicable to the reform that you're actually working on. I want to talk specifically about rearrest. As I said at the beginning, come from the pretrial context, and rearrest rates often come up in this context. And I think there's some specific questions worth asking if you're working on pretrial matters and you start to hear about rearrest, pretrial rearrest, people who are being rearrested while they're released and their cases are pending. So here's some questions worth asking. Were the people that the stat is talking about arrested while they were still on pretrial release or at some point after their pending cases ended? We've seen reports, studies from, for example, the bond industry that track people for 2 or 3 years, regardless of whether their case is still pending, which of course is going to pull all sorts of noise into your data and make that number seem higher. Always ask, were the arrests for new crimes or for technical violations of pretrial conditions? And also note, does the measure, and I'm sure the answer will always, pretty much always be no on this question, but does the measure account for systemic factors that affect likelihood of arrest? Things like age and neighborhood, etc. Because these are arrest rates specifically, those local patterns of arrest are going to matter a lot in terms of who ends up back in the system through rearrest. All right. So I've been throwing around some sort of hypothetical numbers, but let's talk about how high recidivism is really. So, okay, this is a national estimate of recidivism. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give this estimate, and then I'm going to give you 5 different caveats about why this estimate might be a little dicey and isn't maybe something that we should rely on as the primary measure of recidivism. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics is the federal agency that collects all sorts of data from across the country about the criminal legal system. And the data that gets cited generally is from a 2008 release cohort. And the reason is because they use a 10-year follow-up window. So you have to be that long ago to be looking at data in 2018, which is the last time they did the study. And they look at the cohort of people who were released from prison in 2008, and here's what they found. 66% were rearrested within 3 years, 48% had an arrest that led to a conviction within 3 years, 49% returned to prison within 3 years. You can see by these numbers, actually, that how these 3 measures are sort of fundamentally different. Like, it's not true that there are always fewer people who return to prison than are convicted, or different the numbers don't always relate, because as I said, these different measures include different behavior. Some of them include technical violations, some of them don't. So let's talk about the caveats. Certainly, if you're ever faced with this particular statistic, I have a lot that I can tell you about what to do with it. But I think that, frankly, this kind of statistic is often what we run across when we're having debates about recidivism statistics in the policy space. So here's the first caveat. Recidivism has likely dropped substantially since 2008. The federal numbers are fairly old. A lot of recidivism numbers are fairly old, and the reason is because of the length of these follow-up periods. Generally, you're looking at data about people who were released at least 3 years ago, likely longer, depending on how often your state, for example, looks at recidivism again. And that can be really important to think about, especially in the context of changes in state policy. So if you're looking at a recidivism number where the releases predate some big change, like a change to the way parole and probation conditions are enforced, for example, you might be able to say to policymakers, hey, this number is probably not all that relevant to what we're talking about now. Generally, the Council on State Governments estimates that recidivism has dropped by about 23% nationally between 2008 and 2019. And in some states, there's been an even bigger drop. So in California, for example, the rate dropped from 64% to 23%. There's a lot of reasons for this drop. One is falling crime rates, which have affected everything in the criminal legal system statistics space. But the other is the way we deal with technical violations. A lot of states have made some changes in what kinds of parole violations, for example, they reincarcerate people for. And because these recidivism numbers are not just about new crimes, they're also about technical violations, when you make those kinds of changes, you decrease your recidivism rate. So this is the more complicated caveat, but I want to walk through it, and I'm going to make sure the toolkit includes a link to a blog post that I think explains this point really well, but I'm going to do my best. The basic concept is that cohort-based models, which are what almost all recidivism numbers are measured in, chronically overestimate recidivism. Recidivism is generally measured by cohort. It looks at the set of people released in a given time period, then it follows them for a period of time and counts how many recidivism events they have. The problem with this is that the group of people that you're measuring is going to have more people in it who are people who return to prison multiple times. So imagine if you stopped people in a mall on a given day and asked, how frequently do you come to the mall? You're going to get you're going to end up running into more people who are repeat mall visitors. And that's going to make your overall rate of how often do you come to the mall seem higher. So only about 11% of folks, so a relatively small percentage of folks, return to prison multiple times. Most people don't return to prison at all. And then there's a subset of folks who return, about 68% don't return at all, at least according to some studies. And then another about 20% return one time. And then you've got this 11% that returns multiple times. But that 11% is going to be represented more strongly in these cohort-based models. Basically, this is all a really long way of saying recidivism rates seem higher than they really are if you appropriately weight your statistics. And I have found one state that does it. Pennsylvania did a study like a number of years ago that did actually weight their recidivism statistics correctly and show this difference. Your recidivism rate will drop from maybe 60% down to almost 30% in at least some of the studies that have made this comparison. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind. You may not always be able to explain to policymakers that this is something they should care about, but we should be aware that when we hear this number, it's just not the case that 60% or 66% or whatever of folks are being rearrested or reconvicted or going back to prison. The third caveat, especially if you're at the state level and you're being faced with national recidivism numbers, is that recidivism varies hugely across states. So this is a graph that comes from the Virginia Department of Corrections Research Department, which is why Virginia is highlighted. And I know the numbers are a little small, but essentially it shows that recidivism, and these are 3-year reincarceration rates, which, as I said, is the most commonly measured kind of recidivism, range from about 18% in South Carolina all the way up to like 60% in Alaska. Note that a lot of these numbers, again, because this is newer data than the federal data, are still much, much lower than that federal number we talked about to begin with. But if you're doing reform in South Carolina or Virginia or anywhere, one of these other states that has an unusually low recidivism rate, you should highlight that to policymakers and also make sure that you understand why it is that that recidivism rate is so low. Is it because of the way technical violations are handled? Is it because of crime rates? What's going on? The fourth caveat is something that I've been talking about, but I'm going to highlight it a little bit more directly here. Technical violations distort our understanding of recidivism. About 29% of prison admissions nationwide are for technical violations of probation or parole. Now, unfortunately, we don't have data that splits those out in a really consistent way because, of course, if we're talking about prison recidivism, we're most interested in those parole numbers. But it gives you a general sense that there are a lot of people who are being admitted to our prisons who are being admitted for behavior that isn't criminal, that is a technical violation. It's always worth asking what portion of a recidivism statistic is made up of technical, non-criminal behavior. As I said earlier, increasingly states are starting to pay attention to this, especially because there have been some national efforts by groups like the National Council of State Legislators to actually pay attention directly to technical violation questions. So there are some states that have been working intentionally on this issue, and so they measure these stats separately. There's still lots and lots of places that don't. Pointing that out and making sure that you understand, like there are some states where a huge proportion, if you ask this question, you'll find that a huge proportion prison admissions are actually related to technical violations. And that is really important to helping policymakers understand what recidivism statistics mean. If they're hearing, 40% of folks who are released from prison go back to prison within 3 years, we want them to be hearing, and that's because our parole system incarcerates folks for breaking rules that aren't criminal, and not hearing 40% of folks are being rearrested for violent crimes, which is simply not the case. And then the last point that I want to make is, again, thinking about what people think of when they say recidivism versus what recidivism actually is, which is that recidivism involving new violent crimes is really quite rare. We can think of these as these Willie Horton style events, the things that politicians most fear. And it can be helpful to reassure politicians that it's not that common. This isn't to say that it won't happen. And it isn't to say that when it does happen, it's not going to create political blowback. But it is important to contextualize that these events are relatively rare. Unfortunately, most states do not differentiate in their recidivism statistics violent crimes from nonviolent crimes, let alone any divisions within those that would let you make more detailed findings. There are 2 states we found that do. California at least divides its recidivism numbers by people who were reincarcerated for example, felony crimes against persons versus felony drug crimes versus misdemeanor property crimes, those kinds of categories. And it found that only about 7% of folks were convicted for a new felony crime against persons within 3 years. Of people who got convicted, about half of new convictions were for misdemeanors. So again, we're talking about behavior that doesn't match up with that stereotype of the Willie Horton style event. New York also has one study that looks at recidivism actually by a charge that someone has been reincarcerated for. And so there we can actually talk about murder, probably the thing that people fear the most. And less than 2% of people who returned to prison after being released did so because of a murder. It's very, very rare. So I'm going to talk now about the thing that comes up a lot. And this is where just to plug another one of our webinars, about a year ago, we did a webinar on the concept of carve-outs. Very often when, as reformers, we try and push reforms forward, we find that politicians want to carve out or exclude people with certain types of charges, usually violent charges and sex-based charges. That webinar is on our website. I'm not going to reiterate the whole thing, but suffice to say, if we were to exclude folks with violent convictions or sex-related convictions from all reform, we're not going to end up seeing a reduction in mass incarceration. We have to include people with serious charges if we're going to genuinely change the number of people who are imprisoned in this country. And that means getting past policymakers' stereotypes about what the folks with violent convictions are like, what their recidivism numbers are like, and what they have to worry about. So let's start with people convicted of violent crimes. Contrary to myth, people incarcerated for violent crimes who are released are the least likely category of folks to be arrested again. This is for a lot of reasons. There's some that we sort of can't shake out, but one, just to have a little contextualization in your brain, is that people who are incarcerated for violent offenses generally serve longer prison sentences, which means they're generally older when they're released. Older folks are less likely to have recidivism events. So that's at least part of what's going on here. But regardless, there is this belief that folks who are incarcerated for a serious violent crime are somehow doomed to repeat it when released. And it's simply not the case. People who are released after serving time in prison for violent offenses are the least likely to be rearrested for any offense, the least likely to be convicted again, the least likely to be incarcerated again. the least likely to be sentenced to prison again. And you can see that the difference is actually quite stark between, 51% rearrest rate within 3 years for people with drug convictions versus a 25% rearrest number within 3 years for people with violent convictions. These are Bureau of Justice Statistics numbers. So, it's really something to remind folks of. There have been studies around the country, and this comes up a lot in parole, in the context of parole reform, but increasingly there have been small studies around the country of folks who have been released based on changes in the law, that mean that folks with very serious charges are released. And the recidivism numbers of these groups are very small. You can check out a group called the UNGERS, the UNGERs, UNGERS in Maryland. In that situation, a large number of folks with mostly murder and sex-related charges were released because of a legal ruling that said that their underlying cases had been flawed. The jury selection process had been flawed. What it meant is that a lot of people with those kinds of charges got out at the same time. They were given a fair amount of support from nonprofits and academic sources and other sources, but their recidivism rates are incredibly low. We're talking, there's a couple hundred of them. We're talking 1 or 2 people who have gone back to prison or been rearrested. And so when we're talking to politicians about people who have been charged with violent offenses, we want them to understand that we're actually talking about the least risky group of folks to release, not the most risky group of folks to release. It's the exact opposite of what their general assumptions are, and helping them understand that can be really valuable. And we'll talk a little bit later about some sort of holistic strategies for how to get people to understand those stories. So let's talk about sex-related crimes, which is probably the biggest elephant in the room of recidivism. There is an incredibly pervasive myth out there that people with sex-related offenses are somehow different, categorically different than other groups of folks who have been released from prison. There's this myth that somehow they can't help but reoffend, and reoffend with the same kind of crime that they were incarcerated with to begin with. This is just not true. It's a myth that has, I think, a lot of narrative power. These are among some of the most vilified folks in our society, and suggesting that they are likely to harm people again is a way to further vilify them. And so it plays into people's natural biases, and that's why it ends up being so pervasive. Prison Policy Initiative actually published a briefing a couple years ago about how even groups that really should know better, like the Bureau of Justice Statistics, play into this myth when they're presenting stats about people who are incarcerated for sex-related crimes. And I'll make sure that link is in the PowerPoint, and we'll make sure that everybody gets it. It's also in the toolkit itself. But here's the reality. People with sex-related offenses have the lowest overall rearrest recidivism group rates of any charge group. Lower than violent, lower than property, lower than drugs, lower than public order. Now, sometimes you will hear people go sort of a particular way, and there's like, well, it is true that folks with sex-related underlying offenses are more likely than other groups to be rearrested for a sex crime in the future than other groups. That is true. However, that's also true for all of the other groups. If you're released for a drug crime, you're more likely to be rearrested for a drug crime. You're released for a violent crime, you're less likely to be rearrested overall by a lot. But there is a correlation for what you'll be arrested for. And so if you do see someone going for that particular part of the statistic, it's helpful to note that that's a general trend in how recidivism works. It's not something specific to people with sex-related crimes. Another question to ask, and I don't have an answer to this in most places, but It is also true that if registry violation crimes are counted as sex-related crimes in those numbers, it's worth noting that only folks on the sex registry could ever be rearrested for a registry crime. So if all of that stuff's getting lumped together, of course you're going to see folks with sex-related convictions more likely to be arrested for sex-related crimes, because of course if those registry crimes are being considered in that way. So there's a lot of nuance to what's being counted. There's a lot of nuance to how we're talking about this, and trying to break through some of those stigmas is incredibly important, because sex-related charges are the most common carve-out we see, even in reforms in very progressive states that have targeted people with really serious offenses. They will still end up exempting folks with sex-related crimes. And that's something that ultimately isn't fair and isn't supported by the data. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Emmett, and hopefully when I spotlight, I will do it correctly this time, to talk a little bit about how we can get beyond this recidivism conversation and think about broader ways to talk about reentry.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. So how do we get beyond the recidivism conversation, right? So a lot of times recidivism is pictured as a personal failure, right? But it can actually be looked at as a call to action for more services and support, right? Recidivism doesn't happen in a vacuum. Next slide, please. Yeah. Recidivism doesn't happen in a vacuum. Even when it is the result of people actually being arrested for new crimes, we know that there are things that we can do to support people so that they have stronger community connections and they're less likely to reenter the system, right? Visitation, family connections, these kinds of things, they increase the chance that of successful entry for people when they leave prison. Um, also say that I know from my own experience as well as from the data that the initial stages of reentry are the most challenging, frankly, and that they're the most likely to see someone actually return to prison. Recidivism is most common after, shortly after release, which actually says that that's probably a perfect time to implement more support for folks who are returning home. We know that people with employment, stable housing, these kinds of things, that they're much, much less likely to reenter the system. And so providing access to those or their services, that's a key response that we can have to these higher recidivism numbers that people are holding up. Um, and in fact, the work of building and encouraging reentry support systems, that shouldn't happen once someone comes home. This should happen well before people ever uh, exit the prison, right? We know that the policies that, again, that support family connections, all of these things, they decrease those are recidivism rates. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we can also talk about are probation and parole conditions, right? And in a lot of places, we see that there are really strict parole conditions in place that make it much more difficult for people to reenter, particularly because we're putting up all these barriers to successful reentry when we should, again, be offering support and resources to folks. Um, so strict community supervision conditions, that high recidivism rates say much more about that than it does about the person. And loosening those restrictions and using incarceration only as a last resort will actually decrease those recidivism rates. Next slide, please. So just a few other measures of reentry success, right? It's not just about what you don't do, it's about what you're able to do, right? Employment, gainful employment, someone who's able to get a job, secure a job, and keep like these are measures of success. Housing, or is someone able to go back to school and complete their education? Are they able to get help for substance use? Develop strong social relationships and strengthen these family ties that may have been harmed by the incarceration that they experienced. And again, like the successful completion of community supervision, all these things, we need to change the narrative around reentry so that the decision makers are not solely focused on those numbers, but on what really helps people succeed. And I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to what Emmett said that wasn't on the slide, which is that once we are talking about these other kinds of measures of success, it can be really helpful, really important, vital to have formerly incarcerated people tell their own stories. The story of how someone re-enters society after prison is so much richer than the question of whether at some point during that time they were rearrested or had an interaction with the system again. It's a story about their families. It's a story about their incomes and jobs and housing. And as policymakers are able to understand the complexities of those stories, they may be able to better shift their focus to some of the more productive ways they could be thinking about reentry. All right, so we're going to get to questions in a second, but I wanted to first share a little bit about what resources Prison Policy Initiative has on this topic, and then also a little bit about Emmett and me and the advocacy department and how that works. So 3 big Prison Policy Initiative resources that touch on recidivism. The first is the toolkit that led to this webinar, the Recidivism Toolkit, which includes counter arguments talked about in this presentation in one easy-to-use document. Every year, we also publish The Whole Pie, and The Whole Pie just came out after amazing work from our research director that talks about, it's really comprehensive information about everyone incarcerated in the United States. But it also includes a myth-busting section that's incredibly useful. And that includes a section on myths surrounding recidivism. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a couple years ago, we put out a briefing specifically on recidivism of people incarcerated for sex-related offenses, which is linked here and also in the toolkit. My other big plug is please join our newsletter. You can go to www.prisonpolicy.org/subscribe. I misspelled subscribe there, but you know how to spell subscribe probably. And I'll put the link in the chat to register for our newsletter. We send all sorts of helpful information about our new publications, about new additions to what we call our research library, which is a repository of new research about criminal legal system reform and issues about really everything under the sun that's related to these topics. So it can be an incredibly useful resource, and we don't spam you. We send out newsletters, but not every day. And then lastly, this is my big push. Emmett and I do these webinars as part of our jobs, but the other thing, the major thing we do, is help out local advocacy campaigns who need support to help make their dreams of criminal legal system reform a reality. Our advocacy team can assist with all sorts of things. We do custom research, we do data analysis, we do legislative testimony, we do fact sheets and other communication materials. We've really done a huge range of individualized projects to help your advocacy campaign reach its potential. We work with every group individually to figure out what the best thing for that group is and what they need. We prioritize working with small groups that don't have access to in-house research support. So we've worked with groups as small as 1 or 2 volunteers, all the way up to larger groups that have a little bit more oomph to them. But we really are interested in being that sort of auxiliary research department if you are such a small organization that you don't have one. That's what we're here for. We are totally free. I probably should have led with that. We don't charge. We will never charge. And we're very happy to help folks out all over the country. We also work on pretty much every issue under the sun. Everything from pre-arrest diversion all the way to reentry and in between. One particular area of focus for us recently has been on jail expansion. So places that are trying to build new jails. If that is true of your community, and you'd like to fight the building of a new jail in your community, please get in touch with us. We do a ton of that work, but we also do work on everything from prison conditions to pretrial work, really a huge range. How do you reach us? This is how you reach us. We have a general email that you can send things to. That's advocacy@prisonpolicy.org. There's also a contact form on our website that we check every single day and respond to at prisonpolicy.org/contact. You can see too my and Emmett's direct emails. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or think that we could be helpful with your advocacy campaign. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and start thinking about Q&As. And Emmett, I think I've got these open. I can probably run them myself, and I'll pull you in as well as we go through these. The first question is, as we all know, employment is difficult for returning citizens. Background checks are often done by third-party independent companies who often misunderstand the legal documents presented. So there are a way to uphold these companies to legal standards so individuals are not denied jobs. This is a little different than the recidivism conversation, but it does come up because these questions of having records impede the kind of support that we need for folks to have in order to avoid recidivism events. This is very difficult to do, I will say up front. I would say that from what we've seen, there is legislation that can be passed that requires that companies not use certain kinds of information. But the thing that I have seen firsthand is that the most important part of those laws, if you get them passed, is implementation. Once those laws are passed, there has to be follow through to make sure that the agencies involved and that the companies involved are actually doing what the law requires, and that there's some sort of legal remedy, usually through the courts, to enforce against companies that aren't. So that'd be my major piece of advice for that. But I think, yeah, paying attention to those questions about records can be incredibly helpful. Second question we have here is, and I'll throw this to Emmett as well, is given the misinterpretation of recidivism rate, is reconvictions for felonies the best measure of what most policymakers/public worry about? Or does this feed into the violent versus nonviolent dichotomy that only feeds the prison industrial complex? I mean, you want to take this one first? You have anything to add here, and then I'll throw it in.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I don't think that recidivism is an accurate measure of how people succeed. I think what's put out there a lot of times is that the violent crime. Like recidivism is conflated with violent recidivism when we talk about it in any instance, right? Um, but but again, as we spoke earlier, I think what actually, what people fear is that violence. They fear being, seen as people who are like light on crime and these kinds of things like that. Again, what we have to focus on is the support systems, are the successes, are the success stories, are the support that people have, right? And so, um, yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it like that and just let it go to Sarah.
I think fundamentally, I agree with the premise of this question. I don't think recidivism rates are a great way to measure success. I think focusing on recidivism rates does feed the prison industrial complex. Part of the reason that we did this webinar, though, is that to a certain extent, policymakers are going to focus on these numbers, whether we want them to or not. And we're always going to be faced with these questions. So as we work to make people have a broader understanding of what reentry success means, we also need to be able to know what these numbers mean and some ways to attack them directly. All right, Nicole had a question, and I love this question. So as we've touched on, recidivism is often a default metric for evaluating interventions, but programs like parenting education, family engagement, broader impacts, such as strengthening parent-child relationships and improving family stability. How can we shift the conversation to ensure that success is measured in a way that reflects these outcomes rather than focusing on recidivism rates? Is there any argument that would support the conflation of engaging children with their incarcerated parents and recidivism? I'm not sure I totally understand that last part of the question, but I can definitely answer the first one. In order to make people focus on these numbers, we have to measure them. A lot of times, everybody, including, I think, reform-minded folks, are so focused on recidivism because it is the default metric that is sort of what we pay attention to primarily, instead of establishing really robust measures of reentry success. So, when I go out to try and find statistics about reentry success, it's incredibly difficult to find research that specifically says, okay, here's this intervention. Did it affect parent-child relationships, the strength of parent-child relationships? Did it affect employment rates? Some of that stuff exists mostly in the academic literature, but I find that, it's also a call for funders. Often in evaluation of programs, everything tends to come back to that recidivism number. And so this is a culture change that I think we have to push from within in the reform movement. Is we've got to be able to say, we're going to pay attention to these other measures of success. Emmett, anything to add there?
Sure, I will say that there are things like prison nursery programs. There are some programs that exist within prisons that emphasize the importance of children engaging with their parent that have seemed to have been pretty successful, and so that might be worth looking into as well.
Jeannie asks, when counting technical violations, it would be good to include failure to register convictions for people on the sex offense registry. Any tips on how to find that number? It's hard, is my answer, which is not a super helpful answer. I agree with you. I think that we should be recontextualizing registry convictions as a kind of technical violation. Yes, because of the way the laws are written, they are usually new convictions, new felony convictions as well, but they involve behavior that wouldn't be criminal if someone weren't on the registry. That being said, it can be incredibly hard to find these numbers. I think the best we can do is start advocating for the state and national groups that record these numbers, particularly at state level groups, since every registry is really different, to start paying attention to these numbers. I don't have off the top of my head groups that are measuring this well, frankly. I think that it's a problem everywhere. But I agree with you that just rhetorically, we should be talking about failure to register convictions as a kind of technical violation. All right. Sophie asks, and this is a quick one, just to clarify about the cohort-based models, BJS is counting unique recidivism events, not recidivism events per person. It's actually really complicated when you look at the different tables. Some of them are doing one thing, some of them are doing the other thing. Basically, the answer to your question is yes, they are counting total recidivism rates within a cohort, and they are not differentiating whether somebody got arrested multiple times in 10 years. They're not counting that differently than they're not counting one person getting arrested 10 times differently than 10 people getting arrested one time. Let me see here. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through because we have some that are copies. Someone asks if we can drop the name of or a link to the PA study that did it right. Yes, I will put that in we'll have a landing page for this webinar that includes the slides and the video and a bunch of links. I'll make sure that one's included. Donald asks, have you considered that many folks recidivate to get off the streets due to housing insecurity, especially during the winter and a lack of affordable health care? 3 hots and a cot beats no hots and no cot. I think that I would challenge us to think about whether this is some sort of intentional behavior or whether our over-policing of folks who don't have houses is leading to folks getting reincarcerated for things that shouldn't be criminal in the first place. While certainly we all hear anecdotal stories about folks who look for services in jail in that way, I haven't seen studies that suggest that that's a particularly common situation. A more common situation is people are on the street That means they're exposed to arrest more often because they're exposed to more police contact, and they get arrested for public order violations. So I think it's less a question of intentional behavior as it is a question of exposure to law enforcement. If you're around law enforcement more because you're outside more, you're going to be arrested more. Yeah, go ahead, Emmett.
Just to say something real briefly about that, if indeed that is the case, that folks are intentionally getting arrested for those services, that is indicative of a lack of actual support in the community. That means that we really need to redirect some of that money that we're spending in that jail to the services in the community.
Yeah. Okay, our next question. I'm so happy we have so many questions. This is great. So recidivism rates are going down and are overblown anyway. But prison is still a very bad way to help people become better citizens. I've also often used recidivism as a way to explaining that. It's like you have a class and about 30% of the class fails the exam. What's your advice about handling this issue? I definitely have thoughts about this, but I'll let Emma go first.
Well, again, yeah, again, like if the metric that you're using shows that what you're doing is failing, you should try something else. I think that's exactly, you know.
Yeah, and I think the framing that we need to be focusing on, and this is particularly, I've used this framing in the pretrial context to a lot of success, is noting that it's not just that that people who get out of prison are not staying out of, are coming back to prison. We know that prison is a causal reason why people's lives are destabilized and then they continue to return to the system. So in the pretrial context, for example, which is somewhere I know the numbers really well, incarcerating somebody for even a couple days can increase the likelihood of them being rearrested by 18 to 30%. Be huge impacts. And so it's more than just that the system is failing, it's counterproductive. And I think that can be really helpful framing, especially as we have this single-minded focus on public safety. So many times we hear, well, what I really care about is public safety. If you really care about public safety, you should incarcerate fewer people because incarceration ultimately causes more crime. And it's a simple way of putting it, but I think is something that's supported by the research, and is something that recidivism rates can help us talk about, right? Is yes, it is true that folks who are released are finding themselves back in the system. There are reasons for that. Just a couple days in jail is going to mean your housing is disrupted, your employment is disrupted, your family is disrupted, let alone longer periods of incarceration that are disconnecting you entirely from your community. So, yeah, I think that's a really helpful framing, because we care about public safety too in the reform community. Of course we do. And our work is public safety work. Decreasing mass incarceration makes us safer in the long run. Um, um, Amanda asks, what's the best place to find what technical violations exist and which ones can send someone back to prison? I have a helpful prison policy initiative resource to point you to on this. Very recently, we published a piece on conditions of probation, that talks about all the different standard conditions of probation that exist around the country. Those are just the standard ones to give you a sense of what that looks like. But generally, what I've done when I've looked at this question is actually to look at the parole website and there are often things like participant handbooks that will actually list out, here are the different violations. In terms of what can send you back to prison versus what can't, unless you live in a state that has recently passed legislation to actually limit the use of reincarceration for technical violations, in general, the rule is if it's a violation, you can be reincarcerated for it. Doesn't mean you always are, but generally there's a huge amount of discretion for officers about who gets reincarcerated and for what. There are some states, if you check out Reform Alliance's work, they've done a lot of the work around the country, or they've participated in a lot of the work around the country, that has limited occasionally the use of reincarceration for technical violations, but it's still true that primarily there's a huge amount of discretion to reincarcerate people. And sometimes these technical violations, sometimes the categories can be incredibly broad. Things like, not, very vague things like associating with dangerous people or people with criminal convictions or things like that are really hard to get around. Em, anything you want to add? I just don't want to go on and
There is a question here that I like is that I think that reentry should start at entry. Often we see reentry as the last few years of prison when people have decades of trauma. How do we get this idea into the system? I will say that I really love this idea. I think that when people come into the system, when people are entering prison, that should be this time when folks are planning to go home, right? Like that's how we should begin that. I know that there are some groups around the country who are working to implement something like that, but it is really uh, building up that idea with the policymakers, with the people who make the laws that this is important, that it is important to set those structures in place from the very beginning. But I know Sarah might have some more ideas as well.
I think you covered it. I think that's great. Just going through here. Uh, how do we get policymakers, this is from an anonymous attendee, to shift their preoccupation with law and order and take seriously the material needs that people have when they're released? I would think that if policymakers were concerned with people committing new offenses when they are released, they would substantially invest in reentry programs, transitional housing, guaranteed income, etc., instead of doubling down on investments in policing that don't prevent crime. Yeah, this is the whole ballgame. Um, the I think the answer comes back to what I said in an earlier question in terms of framing. To a certain extent, this will always be difficult. We have a hugely pervasive narrative in this country that law enforcement is the solution to crime. And a hugely powerful law enforcement lobby that will push that narrative at every opportunity. The research shows differently, and the experiences of people in their communities shows differently. And so we really, but I think that, as I said before, making it clear that we care about public safety as well. Reformers aren't interested in decreasing public safety overall. We're interested in decreasing mass incarceration. Those two things are connected. I think, that can be for thoughtful policymakers, for those who are interested in engaging with what you're talking about. Talking in terms of public safety when you can be helpful. It's not the only thing you want to talk about. Public safety, reentry outcomes like employment are also important separate from public safety, but they do affect public safety. People who are employed, for example, are less likely to be rearrested. So when you've got a policymaker who's really single-minded about, well, I want to know what the crime rate's going to be, there are ways to talk about the ways in which the work that we do also affects that crime rate and also affects those recidivism rates. I had two questions about sort of visitation. One asks if we can share the information about how visitation reduces recidivism. Yes, we have a whole briefing on it. I will make sure it's linked in the resource page. And then the second question is whether there's data regarding interactions with community volunteers while incarcerated and recidivism rates. It's interesting. I actually have just been going deep in the data, deep in the research on this visitation question for our partner. So I'll try to answer this with some detail. Most of the research that's been done on visitation has been done on family visitation, immediate family visitation, and often visitation by children specifically. I'm not aware of a huge amount of research. There is some relatively old but interesting research that measures overall visits from anybody, and shows a recidivism decline. But I'm not aware, at least off the top of my head, if anybody has it, please email me, of a study that specifically looks at non-family, like community volunteers who aren't related to people. There are a number of studies, though, that talk about these kinds of programs in prison. So education programs, things like that that involve community volunteers. So I might look more towards that programming question than looking specifically at visitation and interaction with community volunteers. So basically what I'm saying is there's been more research on like what kinds of programs work rather than what kinds of people involved in those programs are most successful. Oh, this is a big one. Eric asks, is the concept of desistance, less harmful new cases, helpful in advocacy? It seems hard to make that point. Yeah, I think there was so a lot of the work that we're pulling from in this toolkit comes from an extremely long, like 200-page National Academy of Sciences uh, uh, basically book on recidivism statistics and what we should pay attention to. I'll link that in the resource page as well. This is one of the main points they make, that the process of stopping criminal behavior is just that. It's a process. It is not true that for many people, it is not true that they will commit crimes for, some period of their lives and then immediately stop. Instead, there is this pattern as they're arrested for less serious issues as they move through their lives that eventually lead to someone not engaging in criminal behavior at all. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's an incredibly important conversation for us to have amongst ourselves, because I don't hear us talk about that concept very much at all. I think it's a hard one with policymakers because they hear crime and they hear crime. Crime is crime, right? And it's hard. It can be difficult, I think, to convince folks that certain kinds of arrests are less bad, or that somebody who has a violent crime, we should be happy that they're getting arrested for less serious crimes. But that is the story of how people leave criminal behavior. So I don't have a great answer for this other than to say, I think you've made a really good point. And I think, if you're having a conversation with a policymaker who's really open to this, it's worth talking about that process. I also think that we need to work better in the reform community to figure out how to talk about desistance. Emmett, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think you covered. I totally agree.
Yeah. Um, David asked, I think that reentry should start at entry. Often we see reentry as the last few years of prison when people have decades of trauma. How do we get this idea into the system? I think you're right. I think that what we have seen from the recidivism research is that both programs that are done in prison and things that are done post-release are valuable in reducing recidivism. So it isn't helpful to wait until the last 2 weeks before someone's released and then try to make a plan and make sure that they have what they need when they get out. You're not going to be able to do it well. And you're right, the decades of trauma that someone's experienced mean that you've already done the harm that we're concerned about in terms of things that lead to recidivism in the long run. So I think paying attention to that wide range of different things. I also think there's often this focus on programming specifically as a way to reduce recidivism. It's one of the reasons I really focus on the visitation research. So much of what we can do for folks who are incarcerated is keep them connected to their communities rather than trying to sort of create some sort of create programming that is artificial and within the prison system. Keeping people connected to their communities is such an important way to help them be successful. Emma, do you have anything to add? I can't tell from your face. Okay.
No, just that I will just say that when folks find themselves in prison, it's usually not because they're coming from a stable place. It's usually not because they have the support that they need or the resources they need. They're not coming from that place. And so getting people at entry when people first enter prison, and ensuring that there are those support systems, that are a continuation of support in place for that duration of that incarceration would actually, yeah, I think that would give people a much better chance to come home.
Yeah. Rachel asked, and I probably have time for two or three more questions. I'm curious if you were involved of or aware of research into survivor satisfaction in the context of recidivism or alternatives to incarceration. Yes, there's incredibly good research on this. The people you want to look at first is the Alliance for Safety and Justice. They do a big survey every 2 years of crime survivors, and specifically violent crime survivors, about what they want out of a criminal legal system. And the stats are very clear. Most people who have been victimized by violent crime do not find a lot of satisfaction and help in the criminal legal system, and they would prefer alternatives to incarceration. The data is great. I use it all the time. I think that it's really helpful for politicians who, I mean, the most common thing that I would hear at the state level is, well, this isn't fair to victims, if we shorten prison sentences or reform parole or whatever else we want to try to do. And what the reality is, they're speaking for they're speaking for a smaller percentage of victims when they say that. The majority of victims are interested in reform. I see a couple notes about wanting to connect. I'm going to save this and make sure. But if you've put a link in here to want to connect about advocacy, please also email me. Email us at advocacy@prisonpolicy.org, because it will be easy for me to lose these, and I don't want to. I want to connect with as many of you as possible. Let me just see. There's a lot of these questions that have sort of similar themes that we've already talked about, so I don't want to repeat myself, but I'll probably take a couple more. Why is the men's percentage of recidivism higher? It's an interesting question. A lot of reasons. One is that male rates of crime are higher in general. That's the biggest one. So that's true across the board, not just in recidivism numbers. And then the other I would say is police contact. So if you're more likely, not only is it more likely that, like, statistically, males are actually committing crimes, it's also true that they're more likely to have interaction with police that leads to arrest, whether or not they're committing crimes. And the majority of folks in our criminal legal system are already male, so we end up with more technical violations that are going to be folks who are male. So there's a lot of different factors that snowball into that. But primarily, it's a sort of standard demographic factor, that those numbers tend to be higher for men than they are for women. Let me see. We've got a lot of questions specifically about whether individual states record certain kinds of recidivism data. Look at they're usually on those DOC websites. It's there for almost all of them. There'll be a report. The truth is, every state does this differently, unfortunately. I would love if there was a national standard that split out, for example, recidivism by various types of categories, or by demographic and categories, because sometimes you'll get the demographic recidivism data. But as somebody pointed out, like, what you're really interested in is specifically women who are reincarcerated for drug offenses. And that can be very hard to get unless you have a dashboard that lets you play with those different data points. But every state measures something different. And there are some states that are interested, particularly California and New York, have some really detailed data. California has a very detailed dashboard you can work with. I find the California dashboard to be useful even outside California. It's so detailed, because it lets you make some comments about those subgroups of folks that aren't really available anywhere else. And I think I want to make sure that we end on time. Uh, is there anything that can specifically be done to push back against carve-outs, either to legislators or advocacy groups that see carve-outs as necessary to get anything done? Well, those are two different questions. The first is about legislators, which, as I said, we actually have a whole webinar on that is on our website. Yes, I think there are ways to push back against carve-outs. There's a ton of them. Um, the question about what we do within our own reform movements when we think that carve-outs are necessary to get anything done is really hard. Um, we know that there are situations where something's just not moving ever, or at least for a long time unless there's a carve out in it. And that's sort of the story that we're being told by legislators of just like, this is never going to happen. What I always tell people to think about is a lot of times legislators will say, oh, ones who are sort of on the side of thinking that carve outs are a bad idea will say, we can't do that now. We'll come back for those folks later. That is a particularly, I think, spurious argument. The reality is, no one is ever going to pass a law that says just people with violent convictions, the only people who are left after you've done other kinds of reform, just people with violent convictions will now benefit from this reform. The optics of that are so much worse than the optics of granting it for everyone at the same time. And so I caution people about that logic. Oh well, we'll come back to it later. We'll do that later. We'll do that when there's more public will for it. Um, yeah. Uh, and then the last question I'll take is, I think this is interesting. In Michigan, advocates have been working to offer a second look for people who have served 20 years. The pushback is not worries about recidivism, but sheriffs and prosecutors associations who argue that it's important to public trust and victims that convictions and sentences be final. Has anyone successfully countered this argument? I mean, do you have anything I have thoughts, but I want to make sure you have a chance.
I I I do have a couple of thoughts. The first is that one that we change as a society. Our disposition, how we interpret things, how we look at things, our knowledge about things, our data, it changes over time. And so there should absolutely be a way for us to change with that. Um, Another thing I will say in terms of parole, we see this a lot. Like this pushback against parole is not honoring people's, survivors, the bargain that was made, for example. But parole was a part of the sentence, and so that was already considered at the very beginning. And so essentially, you're double jeopardizing someone, right? And a lot of these second look things that people are pushing out there are for folks who were youth when they were convicted, were very young. We know a lot more about the development of the brain science of the adolescent brain and all these other things. So just more information is out there now. And so, yeah, I think that there are some pretty pretty good reasons to actually change the way that we've been doing things. And the primary one being that the way we've been doing things is wrong.
Yeah, I'd also circle back to what I was saying about the Alliance for Safety and Justice and all other information about what victims really want. Very often, law enforcement speaks on behalf of victims as if they're the same thing, and they're not. Um, some of the most successful reform movements I've seen around the country have been in situations where they've been able to form partnerships with victims groups to make pushes for change. Because there are situations in which victims groups are on the side of reform. Not always, but sometimes. And we have those national numbers from groups like Alliance for Safety and Justice that show that it's not necessarily true that victims don't want second chances or want prison sentences that last forever. So focusing on, when you can, focusing on making sure that victims' voices, real victims' voices, are actually in the conversation can be helpful. One of the things I often point out is that the group of folks who have a family member who is incarcerated and the group of folks who are victims of violent crime, and for that matter, the group of folks who are incarcerated versus the group of folks who are victims of violent crime, there's a ton of overlap there. A lot of times we only hear from victims who are from different communities as than the victims than the communities that are primarily impacted by mass incarceration. But there's a huge number of people who fill both roles, who are family members but are also violent crime victims. And helping people speak from both of those perspectives can be really helpful. With that, I want to thank everybody for coming to our webinar. I really appreciate how many people we have here and all the great questions that we've had. As I said, please get in touch with us if you'd like help with an advocacy campaign. Please subscribe to our newsletter, which you can do on our website. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks,
Bye.